In a world where royal protocol dictates every gesture and public emotion is carefully measured, one unguarded moment between Prince William and Catherine changed everything. What began as a routine charity event in a small Welsh village became the most talked about royal moment of the decade, not for its grandeur or ceremony, but for its raw, unfiltered humanity. When the cameras captured what they thought would be another formal royal handshake, they instead witnessed something that would make millions around the world stop in their tracks, reach for their tissues, and remember why love stories still matter. This wasn't just another royal appearance. This was the moment when two people, despite their titles and duties, showed the world that behind the crowns and protocols beats the heart of a love story that began in a university hallway and has weathered storms that would break most couples. What happened in those 60 seconds would trend worldwide, inspire countless tributes, and remind everyone that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we think nobody is watching. But everyone was watching, and what they saw changed how the world viewed not just William and Catherine, but the very nature of public service, personal sacrifice, and enduring love. This is that story. The real story behind the embrace that moved millions. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Snowdonia as Catherine adjusted her coat collar against the Welsh wind. She had been to this village of Llanfairpwll dozens of times over the years, but today felt different. There was a weight in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds and everything to do with the conversation she and William had shared over breakfast at Amber Hall 3 days prior. "We need to talk about what comes next," William had said, setting down his coffee cup with the deliberate care that Catherine had learned over their 20-year relationship meant he was wrestling with something significant. The children had already left for school, their laughter and morning chaos replaced by the kind of silence that makes important conversations both easier and harder. Catherine had known this moment would come. She had seen it in the way William's shoulders had tensed during their recent engagements, in the way he stared out the window during long car rides between events, in the small lines that had appeared around his eyes seemingly overnight. The weight of the crown that would one day rest on his head was already pressing down on him, and with it came choices that would reshape not just their lives, but the very nature of their service to the realm. The charity event in Llanfairpwll was supposed to be routine. The local community center had been working with disadvantaged youth for over a decade, and William and Catherine's patronage had helped them expand their programs significantly. It was the kind of engagement they both genuinely loved. No grand ceremonies or state banquets, just real people doing real work to make their corner of the world a little brighter. But as their car wound through the narrow country lanes toward the village, Catherine found herself memorizing details she usually took for granted. The way the ancient stone walls divided the fields into a patchwork quilt of green. The sheep that dotted the hillsides like scattered cotton balls. The small farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys, each one representing a family, a life, a story that intersected with theirs in ways both profound and invisible. "You're thinking too much," William said from beside her, his hand finding hers in the space between their seats. Even after all these years, he could read her moods like a favorite book, knowing when she was lost in thought and when she needed an anchor to pull her back to the present. "Perhaps," Catherine replied, but she didn't deny it. Thinking too much had always been both her greatest strength and her heaviest burden. It was what had made her a good student at St. Andrews, where she and William first met. It was what had helped her navigate the impossible transition from middle-class girl to future queen. And it was what made moments like these, moments of impending change, feel like standing at the edge of a cliff without knowing if the ground below was solid or if she was about to step into thin air. The village of Llanfairpwll appeared around a bend in the road, like something from a postcard. The community center, a modest building of local stone with cheerful blue trim, sat in the heart of the village, surrounded by the kinds of shops and houses that had been serving this community for generations. A small crowd had gathered despite the early hour and the threatening weather, their faces bright with anticipation and the peculiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that always accompanied royal visits. As their car pulled up to the building, Catherine could see familiar faces among the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who ran the local post office and always saved them homemade Welsh cakes when they visited. Tommy Rodriguez, a teenager whose family had moved to Wales from Spain and who had found his footing through the center's mentorship program. Sarah Williams, the center's director, whose passion for youth development had first caught their attention years ago during a particularly challenging period in their own lives. These people weren't just faces in a crowd or names on an official itinerary. They were part of an extended family that William and Catherine had been building engagement by engagement, visit by visit, conversation by conversation. It was the kind of relationship that couldn't be captured in newspaper headlines or social media posts, but it was real and meaningful in ways that transcended their official roles. The security detail moved with practiced efficiency as William and Catherine stepped out of the car. The crowd pressed forward slightly, not with the aggressive enthusiasm of tourists or tabloid photographers, but with a warm anticipation of people welcoming back dear friends. Children waved small Welsh flags that someone had distributed, their parents holding phones to capture memories they would treasure long after the royal couple had returned to London. Catherine felt the familiar transformation that came with stepping into her public role. Her posture straightened slightly, her smile became more deliberate, and her attention focused with laser precision on the people and purpose before her. This was the skill she had spent years perfecting, the ability to be completely present and authentic while simultaneously maintaining the dignity and composure that her position demanded. But today, underneath that polished exterior, something else was stirring. A sense of urgency that had nothing to do with their schedule and everything to do with the conversation that still awaited them. The decision that would affect not just their future, but the future of everyone who had come to depend on their support and advocacy. William moved beside her with the easy confidence that came naturally to him, shaking hands and making small talk with the effortless charm that had made him one of the most popular royals of his generation. He had learned early how to make each person feel like the most important person in the room, even when surrounded by dozens of others vying for his attention. It was a gift that served him well in moments like these, but Catherine knew that beneath his public composure, he was carrying the same weight she was. Sarah Williams approached them with the kind of smile that could light up a room, her enthusiasm for the center's work evident in every gesture. "Your Royal Highnesses, welcome back to Landfairpool. We're so grateful you could join us today, especially with everything else you have going on." The comment was innocent enough, but Catherine caught the subtle reference to the speculation that had been swirling in the press for weeks. Rumors about William's increased involvement in his father's duties, whispers about changes coming to the royal family structure, questions about what the next phase of their service would look like. The kind of speculation that came with being public figures whose every move was analyzed and interpreted by people who had never met them but felt entitled to opinions about their choices. "We wouldn't miss it," William replied, and Catherine could hear the sincerity in his voice that made his public statements more than just polite protocol. "This community has become very special to us over the years. The work you're doing here, the young people you're reaching, it's exactly the kind of impact we hope to support." As they moved toward the building, Catherine found herself cataloging details with unusual intensity. The sound of Welsh voices mixed with English in the crowd, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery next door, the way the morning light caught the rain puddles on the cobblestones, the feeling of William's hand briefly touching the small of her back as they navigated through the gathering, a gesture so natural and automatic that she doubted he was even conscious of it. Inside the community center, the transformation was remarkable. What had once been a simple multi-purpose room had been converted into a bustling hub of activity. Young people moved between different stations. A computer lab where teenagers were learning coding skills, an art corner where children created murals depicting their dreams for the future, a kitchen area where a cooking class was preparing a traditional Welsh meal, and a quiet reading nook where volunteers helped struggling readers discover the joy of books. Catherine had always been drawn to these kinds of grassroots programs. There was something profound about watching a child discover they were good at something, about seeing a teenager find direction and purpose, about witnessing the moment when someone realized they had value and potential they had never recognized in themselves. It was the kind of work that didn't make headlines, but changed lives in ways that rippled out far beyond what anyone could measure or quantify. Mrs. Catherine. The voice belonged to Emma, a 12-year-old girl who had been coming to the center for 3 years. Her family had gone through a difficult divorce, and the center had become a safe haven where she could focus on her schoolwork and develop her considerable artistic talents. Look what I painted for you. The canvas Emma held up showed a landscape that was unmistakably Welsh, rolling green hills under a dramatic sky, with a small cottage nestled in a valley. But what made it special was the attention to detail, the way the light seemed to dance across the painted grass, the sense of peace and belonging that emanated from every brushstroke. "Emma, this is absolutely beautiful," Catherine said, kneeling down to meet the girl at eye level. "You've really captured the spirit of this place. The way you've painted the light, it's like I can feel the warmth of the sun even though it looks like rain is coming." The girl beamed with pride, but there was something else in her expression, a kind of maturity that spoke to experiences beyond her years. "I wanted to paint something that would remind you of us when you're far away, so you'd remember that we're here, working hard, and making you proud." The simple honesty of the comment hit Catherine like a physical blow. This child, who had every reason to be focused on her own struggles and uncertainties, was thinking about how to give something meaningful to people she saw as important in her life. It was the kind of gesture that reminded Catherine why their work mattered, but it also underscored the weight of the responsibility they carried. "I will treasure this always," Catherine said, accepting the painting with the reverence it deserved. "And I want you to know that even when we're not here, we're thinking about you and cheering you on. You're doing amazing things, and I couldn't be more proud." As they moved through the center, similar interactions unfolded around them. William sat with a group of teenage boys who were learning carpentry skills, listening intently as they explained a project to build garden planters for elderly residents who couldn't maintain their own yards. Catherine joined a circle of girls who were practicing a traditional Welsh song they had been preparing for months, their voices blending in harmonies that spoke of hours of patient practice and shared determination. Each moment was genuine and meaningful, but Catherine found herself experiencing them through a lens she had never used before. She was seeing not just the present impact of their work, but the potential cost of the changes that lay ahead. The conversations she and William would need to have with their team. The decisions that would reshape their priorities and their presence in communities like this one. The reality that increased responsibilities in other areas might mean less time for the kind of direct, personal engagement that had always been the heart of their approach to service. The formal program began in the center's main hall, where folding chairs had been arranged in a circle rather than the typical rows that characterized more formal events. It was a deliberate choice that reflected the center's philosophy. Everyone was equal here, everyone's voice mattered, and the best conversations happened when people could see each other's faces and connect as human beings rather than as speakers and audience. Sarah Williams stood to welcome everyone, but her remarks were brief and focused on the work rather than the visitors. Today is special not because we have royal guests, but because we get to show what happens when a community comes together to support its young people. Every person in this room, our volunteers, our families, our supporters, and yes, their royal highnesses, is part of a team that's changing lives one conversation, one lesson, one moment of encouragement at a time. The presentations that followed were unlike anything typically found at official royal engagements. Instead of polished speeches and carefully rehearsed demonstrations, they heard directly from the young people whose lives had been touched by the center's work. A 17-year-old named Marcus talked about how the mentorship program had helped him navigate the challenge of being one of only 3 black students in his school, giving him both academic support and the confidence to pursue his dream of studying engineering. A 15-year-old named Karis shared how the center's mental health resources had quite literally saved her life during a period when depression had made every day feel impossible. Catherine found herself fighting back tears as story after story unfolded. These young people were facing challenges that would intimidate adults, yet they spoke with remarkable resilience and hope about their futures. They weren't looking for pity or charity. They were sharing their experiences as partners in creating solutions, as active participants in building the kind of community they wanted to live in. William's responses to each presentation showed why he had become such an effective advocate for young people's causes. He asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated he had been listening not just to the words, but to the emotions and experiences behind them. He shared his own struggles with mental health and the pressure of living up to expectations, creating connections that transcended the formal distance that usually characterize such events. But Catherine could see something else in his demeanor, a kind of intensity that spoke to internal calculations and competing priorities. She recognized it because she was feeling it too. The pull between their genuine desire to be present and engage with these remarkable young people and the awareness that other duties were calling them in directions that might limit their ability to maintain these kinds of relationships. As the formal presentations concluded and they moved into the more informal mingling that always characterized their visits to the center, Catherine found herself in conversation with Mrs. Jenkins, the postmistress who had become something of an unofficial community historian over her 73 years in the village. "You seem thoughtful today, my dear," Mrs. Jenkins observed with the directness that comes with age and the kind of relationship that had developed between them over multiple visits. "Is everything all right?" Catherine considered deflecting the question with the kind of polite non-answer that royal training had made second nature. But there was something about Mrs. Jenkins' genuine concern and the weight of the day that made her want to be more honest than protocol typically allowed. "Sometimes the path forward isn't as clear as we'd like it to be," Catherine replied, choosing her words carefully, but allowing a hint of vulnerability to show through. "There are decisions that affect not just us, but everyone we've come to care about. Communities like this one." Mrs. Jenkins nodded with the wisdom of someone who had watched many people wrestle with difficult choices over the decades. "Change is never easy, especially when it involves people you love. But sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that allow us to serve in new ways, even if we have to let go of some of the ways we've served before." The conversation was interrupted by a small commotion near the art corner, where a group of children had gathered around Tommy Rodriguez. At 19, Tommy had aged out of most of the center's programs, but he had stayed on as a volunteer, working with younger children who, like him, were navigating the complexities of growing up between cultures. "Tommy's showing them the mural he's been working on," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "He's been painting the story of this village, but including all the families who've come here from other places. It's quite remarkable, really. He's showing how the community has grown and changed while still honoring what makes it special." Catherine and William made their way over to see Tommy's work, and what they found took their breath away. The mural covered an entire wall and depicted Landfair Pool across different eras, from its ancient Celtic roots through the Industrial Revolution, the two World Wars, and into the modern era with its diverse population of families from across Europe, Asia, and Africa who had made this Welsh village their home. "I wanted to show how change doesn't have to mean losing what's important," Tommy explained, his English still carrying the musical accent of his Spanish childhood. "My family was scared when we first came here. We thought we'd have to choose between being Spanish and being Welsh. But this place taught us that we could be both. That adding something new doesn't take away from what was already here." The metaphor wasn't lost on Catherine. She found herself studying the mural with new eyes, seeing not just an artistic achievement, but a lesson in how communities and families navigate transitions while preserving what matters most. Tommy had painted scenes of continuity alongside scenes of change, traditional Welsh festivals that now included foods and music from around the world, the ancient language taught alongside newer languages that reflected the village's growing diversity, old traditions that have found new expressions without losing their essential meaning. How did you know where to begin? Catherine asked. With such a big project, such an important story to tell, how did you decide what to include and what to leave out? Tommy considered the question seriously. I started with what I knew was true. The land has always been here. The people have always cared about their families and their neighbors. Everything else, the specific ways they've done that, the particular challenges they've faced, those things change. But the foundation stays the same. William had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but Catherine could see him processing Tommy's words with the kind of intense focus he brought to conversations that resonated with his own experiences. As someone who had grown up knowing that his life would be defined by service to others, but who was still learning what that service would look like in practice, Tommy's perspective on honoring tradition while embracing change clearly struck a chord. The afternoon progressed with the usual mixture of structured activities and spontaneous interactions that characterized their visits to the center. They joined a cooking class where teenagers were learning to prepare traditional Welsh dishes with modern twists, adding spices and techniques their families had brought from other cultures, creating something that was both authentically Welsh and authentically their own. In the computer lab, they watched as children who had never had access to technology at home discovered coding and digital art with the enthusiasm of explorers charting new territories. The volunteer teaching the class was a retired software engineer from Cardiff who made the 2-hour drive to Llanfairpwll twice a week, not because he was required to, but because he had found purpose in sharing his knowledge with young people who might otherwise never have the opportunity to develop these skills. What I love about working here, he told Catherine as they watched a 10-year-old girl successfully program her first simple game, is that these children approach everything with such curiosity. They're not intimidated by technology because no one has told them they should be. They just see it as another tool for creating and connecting. Catherine found herself thinking about her own children, about the balance she and William were constantly trying to strike between giving them normal childhoods and preparing them for the unusual roles that awaited them. The children here at the center faced different challenges, but the underlying questions were similar: how to help young people develop confidence and skills while staying connected to their families and communities, how to encourage them to dream big while keeping them grounded in values that would sustain them through both success and disappointment. As the formal program began to wind down, Catherine noticed William having an intense conversation with Sarah Williams near the center's resource library. Even from across the room, she could see the seriousness of their discussion. The way William's posture indicated he was wrestling with something significant. When she approached them, she caught the tail end of a conversation that clearly involved more than just the day's events. The challenge, Sarah was saying, is that sustained impact requires sustained commitment. These young people need to know that the support will be there not just for a special event or a photo opportunity, but for the long haul. That's what allows them to take real risks, to invest in their own growth, to believe that their efforts will be met with ongoing encouragement. William nodded thoughtfully. And if the nature of that commitment had to change, if the same level of direct involvement wasn't possible, but other forms of support could be strengthened? It was the question Catherine had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The conversation they had been avoiding, but knew was necessary. The reality that their increased responsibilities in other areas would require them to make choices about where and how to focus their energy. Sarah's response was measured, but honest. These relationships matter because they're personal. The young people here don't just see you as supporters of the center. They see you as people who believe in them individually. That's not something that can be easily replaced or delegated. But she paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. If changes were necessary, the key would be finding ways to maintain the spirit of that personal connection, even if the frequency or format had to evolve. Before William could respond, they were interrupted by a group of teenagers who had prepared a special presentation for the end of the visit. They had created a video montage of their experiences at the center over the years, including clips from previous royal visits, mixed with footage of their daily activities, their achievements, and their dreams for the future. The video was technically impressive, but emotionally overwhelming. Catherine watched scenes of young people she had come to know well working on projects, celebrating successes, supporting each other through challenges, and growing into confident, capable individuals. Interspersed throughout were moments from her and William's visits, conversations, shared laughter, small gestures of encouragement that had clearly meant more to these young people than she had realized at the time. The final segment of the video featured interviews with current and former participants talking about what the center meant to them, but also what the royal couple's involvement had contributed to their experiences. Their comments weren't about celebrity or prestige. They were about feeling valued, about having adults who believed in their potential, about learning that service to others was something that could take many forms but always required genuine commitment. When their royal highnesses come here, one 17-year-old said in the video, it's not like meeting famous people. It's like having family visit who live far away, but still care about what we're doing with our lives. They remember things we told them months ago. They ask about our projects and our families. They make us feel like what we're doing here matters to people beyond this village. Another young person, a 16-year-old who had been struggling with serious family issues when he first came to the center, put it even more directly. They show us what it looks like when people with opportunities and privileges use those things to lift other people up. That's something we can do too, even if we don't have titles or fancy jobs. We can use whatever we have to help the people around us. As the video concluded, Catherine felt a complex mixture of pride and responsibility settling over her. These young people had learned lessons that went far beyond the specific skills and support the center provided. They had absorbed a philosophy of service and community engagement that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. But they had also formed relationships and expectations that would be affected by any changes in her and William's level of involvement. The formal presentations gave way to the more relaxed atmosphere that always characterized the final portion of their visits. Children who had been somewhat shy during the structured activities became more animated, eager to share their projects and ask questions. Teenagers who had been politely attentive during the speeches sought out more personal conversations, wanted to talk about their plans and dreams with adults who had consistently shown interest in their lives. Catherine found herself in a corner with a group of girls who were working on a project to document the oral histories of elderly residents in the village. It was exactly the kind of initiative that represented the best of what the center encouraged. Young people taking initiative to serve their community while developing valuable skills and forming intergenerational connections. We've interviewed 12 people so far, explained Megan, a 14-year-old with the kind of confidence that came from being encouraged to think of herself as a leader. The stories are incredible. Mrs. Davies lived through the evacuation during World War II when children from London were sent here for safety. Mr. Patel came here in the 1960s to work in the slate mines and ended up starting the village's first international grocery. Mrs. O'Connor raised 7 children while working 3 jobs and still found time to organize the annual festival that brings everyone together. What we're learning, added another girl, is that everyone has a story that matters. Sometimes the people who seem most ordinary have lived through the most extraordinary things. And everyone has wisdom to share if you know how to ask the right questions. Catherine was struck by the maturity and insight reflected in their observations. These teenagers were learning lessons about empathy, community, and the value of different perspectives that many adults never fully grasped. They were developing skills in research, interviewing, and storytelling that would serve them well in whatever careers they eventually chose. But most importantly, they were building bridges between generations and creating a record of their community's history that would be treasured for decades to come. Have you thought about what you'll do with all these stories once you've collected them? Catherine asked. We want to create a book, Megan replied, but also maybe a website where people can listen to the actual interviews. And we're thinking about organizing an evening where people can come and hear some of the stories read aloud, maybe with music and food that represents different parts of the community. The scope of their vision was impressive, but Catherine could also see the challenges they would face in bringing such an ambitious project to completion. It was the kind of initiative that needed adult guidance and support, but not the kind of heavy-handed intervention that would take ownership away from the young people who had conceived and driven it. That sounds like a wonderful way to honor both the stories and the people who shared them, Catherine said. What kind of support would be most helpful as you work toward those goals? The question opened up a conversation about the practical aspects of their project, finding funding for printing and website development, connecting with local historians who could provide context and guidance, navigating the technical aspects of recording and editing interviews. It was the kind of conversation that illustrated both the potential and the complexity of the center's work. These young people needed encouragement and validation, but they also needed concrete assistance with skills and resources they couldn't access on their own. They benefited from having high-profile supporters who brought attention and credibility to their efforts, but they also needed consistent, practical support from people who could help them troubleshoot problems and overcome obstacles. As Catherine listened to their plans and concerns, she found herself thinking about the conversation she and William still needed to finish. The Oral History Project was a perfect example of the kind of work that could continue and even flourish with different forms of support, but it was also the kind of initiative that had grown out of the personal relationships and ongoing encouragement that had characterized their involvement with the center. The afternoon was drawing toward its natural conclusion when Catherine noticed William standing alone near the large windows that overlooked the village square. Something in his posture, a stillness that was different from his usual composed alertness, drew her attention. She had seen this stance before, during moments when the weight of his future responsibilities pressed down on him with particular force. Outside, the threatened rain had finally begun, creating patterns on the glass that fractured the view of the village into abstract shapes. Children who had been playing in the square scattered toward doorways, their laughter echoing off the stone buildings. It was a scene of everyday life continuing its rhythm, unaware of the internal struggles of the man watching from inside the community center. "Penny for your thoughts," Catherine said quietly as she joined him at the window, using the phrase that had become a gentle way for them to check in with each other during public events when direct conversation wasn't always possible. William was quiet for a long moment, his gaze following a young mother as she hurried across the square with her toddler bundled against the rain. "I was thinking about continuity," he said finally, "about what stays the same when everything else changes." Catherine understood immediately. The conversation they had been postponing was weighing on him as heavily as it was on her. The decision that would require them to step back from some of the direct, personal engagement that had defined their approach to service in order to take on broader responsibilities that could potentially have greater impact, but would necessarily be more distant and formal. "Tommy's mural," Catherine said, making the connection. "The way he showed how the village could grow and change while keeping what mattered most." "Exactly. But it's easier to paint a philosophy than to live it." William's voice carried the frustration of someone who had been wrestling with competing values and finding no perfect solution. "These relationships we've built here, with these young people, they matter, not just to them, but to us. They've shaped how we understand our role and what we want to accomplish." Catherine felt her throat tighten. This was the heart of their dilemma. The increased responsibilities they were being asked to assume would allow them to influence policy on a much larger scale, to advocate for young people and community development programs across the entire realm. But those broader responsibilities would require them to step back from the kind of direct, personal involvement that had made their work meaningful to both them and the people they served. "Sarah's right that these relationships are personal," Catherine said. "You can't just delegate caring about someone or replace the impact of genuine attention and encouragement. But maybe there are ways to honor these relationships while also accepting new responsibilities." Before William could respond, they were approached by a small delegation of teenagers who had clearly been elected to represent their peers in a conversation they had been planning for several minutes. Emma, the 12-year-old artist whose painting Catherine was still holding, served as their unofficial spokesperson. We want you to know, Emma began with the serious demeanor of someone delivering an important message, that whatever changes might be coming in your work, we understand that you have to do what's best for the most people, not just for us. The maturity of the statement caught both Catherine and William off guard. These young people had clearly been listening more carefully to the adult conversations around them than anyone had realized, and they had come to conclusions about the nature of the situation that were remarkably perceptive. "We've been talking," continued Marcus, the 17-year-old who had spoken earlier about the mentorship program, "and we want you to know that what you've taught us here isn't just about having royal visitors or feeling special because famous people care about our projects. It's about learning how to care about each other and how to use whatever opportunities we have to help other people. So, if you need to go help more people in bigger ways," added Karis, the 15-year-old whose story about mental health support had been so moving, "we'll still be here doing the work. And we'll remember everything you taught us about how to do it right." Catherine felt tears threatening for the second time that day. These young people had not only understood the situation, but had thought through its implications and come to peace with it in a way that demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence and generosity of spirit. They were essentially offering to release William and Catherine from the obligation to maintain their current level of involvement, while also affirming that the impact of that involvement would continue through the values and approaches they had absorbed. "You have no idea how much that means to us," William said, his voice carrying more emotion than was typical for his public interactions. "But I want you to know that stepping back from some forms of engagement doesn't mean caring less or forgetting about the work you're doing here. It means finding new ways to support what you're building," Catherine added. "Ways that might be different, but could potentially reach even more young people facing the same challenges and opportunities you've faced." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah Williams, who appeared with the kind of diplomatic timing that suggested she had been waiting for the right moment to approach. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're about ready for the closing circle. Would you like a few minutes to prepare?" The closing circle was a tradition at the center that Catherine particularly treasured. Instead of formal speeches or ceremonial presentations, everyone involved in the day's activities would sit together and share one thing they would take away from their time together. It was simple and democratic. Each person got the same amount of time and the same level of attention, regardless of age or position. As they gathered in the main hall, Catherine was struck by how naturally the formal hierarchies that typically structured royal events dissolved in this setting. Children sat next to adults, teenagers were scattered throughout the circle rather than grouped together, and the volunteers were mixed in with the visitors and staff. It was a physical representation of the center's core philosophy, that everyone had something to contribute and everyone deserved to be heard. The sharing began with Mrs. Jenkins, who reflected on how seeing young people take leadership in documenting their community's history had reminded her that each generation has a responsibility to pass on not just stories, but the skills and confidence to continue telling new stories. Tommy spoke about how showing his mural had helped him understand that his own story of navigating between cultures was now part of the village's larger story of growth and adaptation. When it came to the teenagers who had worked on the oral history project, Megan talked about discovering that asking good questions was a skill that would serve her in every area of life, not just in interviews. Another girl reflected on learning that everyone's experiences matter, even when they seem ordinary or unremarkable to the person who lived them. The adults in the circle shared observations about the energy and creativity of the young people, but also about their own learning. The retired software engineer talked about how working with children who approach technology without preconceptions had reminded him of his own early excitement about programming. A volunteer who helped with the cooking classes reflected on how the fusion of traditional Welsh recipes with influences from other cultures was creating something entirely new while honoring what came before. When the circle reached William, Catherine could see him choosing his words with unusual care. "What I'm taking away," he said, "is a reminder that real impact comes from relationships built over time, but also that the values that create those relationships can be shared and extended beyond any particular setting or format. It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging both the importance of their work at the center and the reality that changes were coming, but Catherine could hear the genuine emotion underneath the careful phrasing. When her turn came, she found herself speaking more directly than she had planned. "I'm taking away gratitude," she said, "for being reminded that service isn't about having all the answers or being able to solve every problem. It's about showing up consistently and caring genuinely about people's lives and dreams. And I'm taking away hope because I've seen today how the values we try to model can take root in young people and grow into something even better than what we started with." The final sharing came from Emma, the young artist whose painting had started Catherine thinking about memory and distance earlier in the day. "I want everyone to take away the understanding that caring about each other doesn't have to end when someone goes away or when situations change. Love is portable. You can carry it with you and share it wherever you go." The simplicity and wisdom of the 12-year-old's observation brought the circle to a natural close. But it also created the kind of moment that Catherine knew she would remember for the rest of her life. These young people had not only understood the lessons they had been taught about service and community, but they had internalized them in ways that allowed them to offer comfort and insight to adults who were struggling with difficult decisions. As the formal part of the visit concluded and people began to gather their belongings and prepare for departures, Catherine found herself moving through the center with a different kind of attention than she had brought to previous visits. She was trying to memorize details, the sound of children's voices echoing off the stone walls, the smell of art supplies and fresh bread from the kitchen, the sight of teenagers and adults working together on projects that mattered to them. But she was also seeing with new eyes how the center functioned as a community within a community. The relationships that had been built here weren't dependent on any particular visitor or supporter. They had taken on a life of their own, creating a network of care and encouragement that could sustain itself even as individual circumstances changed. The realization was both comforting and challenging. It suggested that the work they had supported here was strong enough to continue and even flourish with different forms of involvement. But it also meant acknowledging that they weren't as essential to the center's success as they had perhaps allowed themselves to believe. William was having his own series of final conversations, and Catherine could see him struggling with similar recognition. A group of teenage boys had surrounded him to talk about their carpentry projects, but the conversation had evolved into advice-seeking about everything from college applications to relationship issues. It was clear that they saw him not just as a royal patron, but as a mentor whose opinion they valued and whose support they would miss. "The thing is," one of the boys was saying, "you've shown us that being responsible for other people doesn't mean you have to be perfect or have everything figured out. It means you keep trying to do the right thing, even when it's complicated." Catherine watched William's face as he absorbed this observation from a 17-year-old who had learned to navigate some difficult family circumstances with the help of the center's support systems. The teenager was essentially offering him permission to make hard choices while maintaining his commitment to service, but from the perspective of someone who had learned about resilience and leadership by watching William's example over several years. As they prepared for their departure, Catherine was approached by Sarah Williams for a private conversation. They stepped into a small office that served as the center's administrative headquarters, surrounded by filing cabinets full of program records and walls covered with photos documenting years of activities and achievements. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for this community," Sarah began, "but also to talk about what comes next." Catherine appreciated the directness. "We haven't made any final decisions about changes to our involvement, but we recognize that new responsibilities will require us to think carefully about where and how we focus our energy." "I understand completely," Sarah replied. "And I want you to know that whatever form your support takes in the future, the foundation you've helped us build here is solid. These young people have learned that they matter, that their communities need their contributions, and that service to others is both a privilege and a responsibility. But practically speaking, Catherine said, wanting to be honest about her concerns, what happens to programs that have depended on the attention and credibility that come with royal patronage? What happens to funding streams and volunteer recruitment when the profile of your supporters changes? Sarah's smile was reassuring, but realistic. Those are challenges we'll have to navigate, but they're not insurmountable. What you've given us goes beyond visibility and funding, important as those things are. You've helped us create a culture where young people see themselves as leaders and changemakers. That's not something that depends on any particular patron or supporter. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door, followed by the appearance of Tommy Rodriguez carrying a wrapped package. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to give you something before you leave." Inside the wrapping was a smaller version of his community mural, painted on a portable canvas that captured the essential elements of his larger work. The sense of continuity and change, the way different generations and cultures had contributed to the village's evolving identity, the understanding that growth could happen without losing what was most important. It's a reminder, Tommy explained, that communities are living things. They grow and change, but their hearts stay the same. What makes a place special isn't any particular person or program or building. It's the commitment people make to take care of each other. Catherine accepted the painting with a reverence such a thoughtful gift deserved. But she was also struck by the maturity of Tommy's perspective. This young man who had arrived in Wales as a frightened child speaking limited English had become someone who could offer wisdom about identity, community, and adaptation to adults who were facing their own challenges with change and transition. As they prepared to leave the office, Sarah had one final comment. "I hope you know that whatever changes come, you'll always be part of this community's story, not just as supporters or patrons, but as people who helped shape the values and aspirations of an entire generation of young leaders." The weight of that statement followed Catherine as they rejoined the larger group for their final goodbyes. These young people would carry forward not just the skills and opportunities they had gained at the center, but the approach to service and community engagement they had learned by watching how she and William interacted with people whose lives were very different from their own. As they moved toward the entrance, Catherine found herself walking beside Emma, who was still clutching the small bag that contained her art supplies. The girl had been unusually quiet during the final activities, and Catherine sensed she had something on her mind. "Are you worried about the changes that might be coming?" Catherine asked gently. Emma considered the question seriously. "A little," she admitted. "But mostly I'm thinking about how to make sure the things you taught us don't get lost when you're not here to remind us." The honesty and thoughtfulness of the response struck Catherine deeply. This 12-year-old was already thinking about how to preserve and pass on the values and approaches she had learned, recognizing her own responsibility to ensure that important lessons survive transitions and changes. "What do you think is most important to remember?" Catherine asked. "That caring about people is something you do, not something you feel," Emma replied without hesitation. "And that everyone has something valuable to contribute if you pay attention and ask the right questions. And that being special doesn't mean being better than other people. It means using whatever you have to help other people become special too." The wisdom and clarity of Emma's observations provided a perfect segue to the moment that would define not just this visit, but the entire nature of William and Catherine's relationship with this community.